Professor Samuel Martinez, and he's coming over from the University of Connecticut in the anthropology department. He actually works with the Institute for Puerto Rican and Latino Studies. He has served as the chair from 2003 to 2004 of the American Anthropological Association's Committee for Human Rights in 2005. He is the author of 2 ethnographic monographs and several peer-reviewed articles on migration and labor and minority rights of the Haitian nationals, as well as people of Haitian ancestry in the Dominican Republic. His current research continues to bring into critical scrutiny the issues between the writing of northern human rights monitors, as well as our journalists and sociologists with respect to the theme of Haitian-Dominican relations. He is also doing some background research at the moment on historical comparative study of the social organizations and rhetoric campaign against new slavery, which is definitely a situation that we're seeing with the Haitian migrant workers, for example, on the batallas or the sugar plantations in the Dominican Republic. So please join me in welcoming Professor Samuel Martinez.
Thank you, Kristen. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I want to thank everyone for making time on a dreary Saturday afternoon to be in attendance. And I especially want to give my thanks to all the co-sponsors and people who have helped out, but especially to Kristen Holmes for having organized this event. I really would like you to join me in giving her a hand. Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you.
So I approached the study of Haitian-Dominican rights activists from the standpoint of a cultural anthropologist. I've done ethnographic fieldwork in some of these Bate company compound communities in the Dominican Republic, specifically on the Ingenio Consuelo, a state-owned sugar estate in eastern Dominican Republic. Kristen, how much time do we have this room for?
We actually have it until 6, so
Oh.
yeah. You're not going to take that long.
Well, why not? So since 1997, my attention has shifted from this micro-sociological ethnographic fieldwork on sugar plantation communities to encompass some broader frames of analysis like Kristen was referring to. One of these is the activism and advocacy for the rights of Haitian nationals and of their Dominican offspring, with comparing what has been happening locally with organizations that are led by people coming out of the Haitian-Dominican community itself, and international-led solidarity. So my talk today particularly takes its point of departure from this multifaceted capacity-building style of activism that has been developed over the years by Haitian-Dominican rights organizations. With the recent upsurge of international organizations and allegations, including allegations that Haitians work under conditions of de facto slavery in the Dominican Republic. At the end of my talk, or near the end of my talk, I want us to challenge us to think about some new ways of imagining the character of relations between Haiti and Dominican Republic, and new sites of potential solidarity involving people of both nationalities and ancestries, and people internationally as well. Most of my slides I have on the handout that I prepared for you. That will, I hope, free you from any kind of dividing your attention between taking notes on what's up on the screen and what I'm saying to you. So in my work, I refer to these people, these Dominicans of Haitian ancestry, as Haitian-Dominicans. even as other scholars and activists, you either use the Spanish language term, Dominico Haitianos, or its direct English transposition, Dominico-Haitians. There's some disagreement about what's the correct term, so to speak, but both those who refer to this group as Dominico-Haitians and those like me who prefer to call them Haitian-Dominicans really wish to emphasize the same thing, which is that it is a kind of Dominicans that we are talking about, not a Haitian, a foreign presence, not a foreign presence in the Dominican Republic. So this assertion of the Dominicanness of people of Haitian ancestry runs counter to common parlance in the Dominican Republic and to the insistence of people in a xenophobic nationalist elite, which is that the Dominican-born children and grandchildren even of Haitian immigrants are not Dominican, but simply Haitianos, pure and simple, Haitians, not really Dominican. As you know, Haiti and Dominican Republic share the same island, Hispaniola, in the Caribbean. Both share also a history of incursions on their sovereignty by the United States and other great powers of the world. Haiti attained its independence first and did so through a violent overthrow of both European colonialism and industrial slavery, thus gaining the enmity of the world's slaveholding powers. Generally speaking, these kinds of comparisons give emphasis to the difference between Haitian and Dominican culture and language. I think that that insistence on enmity, on difference, is one that conceals a strong current of cultural exchange that exists between the two sides of the island, and that we see evidence of in the languages. There are so many loan words from Haitian Creole and Dominican Spanish, and the opposite words have passed from Dominican Spanish into the Haitian Creole language. And of course, as Professor Dickerman already went into, the two countries have undergone divergent paths of economic development. And especially over the last 20 or 30 years, Haiti's slide into poverty has continued unabated, even as the Dominican Republic has enjoyed annual GDP growth rates in excess of 4% from 1990 well into the decade of the 2000s. All right, that's pretty much stuff by way of background. I want to segue to the main focus of my talk by presenting excerpts from two media reports, each concerning the award of a major international human rights prize to an advocate of the Haitian minority group's rights. The substance of these reports encapsulates contrasts between internationally led rights advocacy, especially that built around the allegation that Haitians are enslaved in the Dominican Republic, and the locally based work of Haitian-Dominican rights activists who work on a variety of fronts, but who give a particular emphasis in recent years to claiming legal residency for immigrant Haitian nationals and citizenship for the Dominican-born children of Haitians. The first of these media reports was broadcast on the BBC World Service. It concerns the bestowal of the Anti-Slavery Award in 1994 to the Episcopal priest, Father Edwin Parizon. Reporter Trish Williams interviewed Parizon in the small city of Barahona, about an hour west of the Haitian border in southwestern Dominican Republic. In the mind, I would say southeastern. As I move through this reportage, I'm going to leave just a few seconds for you guys to read the stuff instead of reading it out for you. Just because you can read it so much faster than I can read over again. As we look at this, we can see more than a decade before the filming of The Price of Sugar, mention is made of two sure signs of slavery: deception and force. Indeed, at the time that Father Parizon received this recognition, in 1994 from the Anti-Slavery Society, it had already been more than 15 years since the conditions of recruitment and employment of Haitian migrants on the Dominican sugar estates had first been denounced internationally as a new system of slavery in the Anti-Slavery Society's own journal. That earliest major international report in 1978 and the bestowal in 1994 of the Anti-Slavery Award on Father Parizon represent bookends of a kind of a first wave of allegations regarding the enslavement of Haitians in the Dominican Republic. Later on in my talk, I'll say more by way of comparison between the first outpouring of new abolitionist reportage and mobilization and the revival of a neo-slavery discourse in just the past 2 or 3 years. The diagnosis of slavery prescribes a remedy of rescue. Now, there's nothing in the neo-slavery discourse that limits our outreach to rescue alone. But the primordial idea is that the slave must first be freed from the clutches of the slaveholder. The mode of solidarity is singular and heroic. The second media report, available on the Haiti Support Group website, dates nearly a decade after the first, and concerns the recognition of Sonia Pierre, head of the Haitian immigrant rights advocacy group, Movimiento de Mujeres Dominico-Haitianas, or Haitian-Dominican Women's Movement, MUDA. And I'll be using that acronym of MUDA quite a lot in my talk. As recipient of Amnesty International USA's 2003 Janetta Sagan Fund Award. There are interesting parallels between this report on Solange Pierre and the one we just read concerning the honor bestowed on Father Parizon by the Anti-Slavery Society. Yet, valor in this report is a quality that not only includes Pierre, but is widely shared among Haitian-Dominicans. I'm just going to let you read this as I page through it. The anecdote accurately reflects the emphasis that Sonia Pierre's activism gives to rights education and community capacity building. The initiative of the oppressed, in this case, consists of exercising the rights of a citizen and staying put in the place where one's parents set down roots. The mode of solidarity in this case, collective and patient. Some of the main points of difference then between these two media reports can be summarized. In the second report, the young Haitian-Dominican girl, Elimé, speaks and acts courageously. In the first, it's only Father Parizon who speaks and who acts courageously. The narrow geographic and demographic focus of the first report, let me see if I can get the cursor to move over there when I'm pointing to geographical coordinates. The first report focusing on the sugar estates and their male seasonal migrant workers from Haiti, enables the issue to be cast simply as one of would-be immigrants turned into slaves through trickery and deceit, executed by traffickers in a scheme designed and profited from by sugar barons. Expanding the geographical and demographic frame in the manner first opened up by the practice of Haitian-Dominican rights groups, reaching beyond the Bateyes and welcoming both Haitian immigrant nationals and their Dominican-born offspring within the compass of activism and advocacy, broadens the picture in more than one way. The statements and practice of Haitian-Dominican rights groups expand the roster of the responsible parties. It expands the list of constraints against which people of Haitian ancestry must struggle, but also expands the fronts on which that struggle can be fought. Later on, I'll say more about that and the reasons why Haitian-Dominican rights activists have pursued such a broad agenda by comparison with the narrower focus of international advocates. More generally, I hope to persuade you that the policy implications are profound of how we frame the issues. It should be equally obvious that the two reports also project distinct gender politics of representation. The new abolitionism differs in substance on matters related to gender from the patient work of capacity building and community mobilization that is championed by Sonia Pierre. Feminization is reflected in the practice and agenda not only of MUDA, but other Haitian-Dominican rights organizations, and is far-reaching. Solange Pierre's elevation to the status of an international symbol for her people's cause is only one aspect of this larger feminization of struggle. To simplify that, as Haitian-Dominican rights groups broaden the spectrum of struggle to encompass rights in all of their dimensions, cultural and economic, as well as civil and political, women and women's rights have moved from the margins to the center of concern. The almost total absence of women's voices and concerns was just one set of ellipses that characterized the first wave of new slavery denunciations from 1978 to 1992. Women are more audible and visible in the latest upwelling of concern about unfree labor. We see women interviewed, for example, in the film The Price of Sugar, Sugar Babies, others that maybe some of you in this audience have had the chance to see. Still, one recurrent feature of the stories being told about slavery today is the impaired manhood of the slave and the assertive masculinity that is its antidote. I must leave it for future research to go more deeply into this, but I think it's safe to say that there are elements of storytelling in today's new slavery allegations that harken back to stories told by earlier generations of abolitionists, and which we still find intrinsically appealing, compelling. I feel obligated to say here first that the object of my critique is not Father Hartley, but the filmmaker who has cast him in the role of a white knight. Coming as I do out of a study of activism, surging up from Batey communities, I can only cringe when the filmmaker chooses repeatedly to feature the testimony of Batey residents to the effect that Father Hartley has become not only a vital catalyzer of their rights struggle, but a necessary, irreplaceable defender of their rights. But worse still is what is left unsaid. In what little is shown in the film of Batey residents meeting to organize in defense of their own rights, no mention is made that there is springing up all over the country in places much like the Bateyes that we visit through the film The Price of Sugar, of community-based organizations that are working in partnership with Dominican-led headquartered and staffed civil society groups, such as MUDA, who are working with or without the benevolent protection of a foreign patron. So if we are to accept the diagnosis of slavery, I think that's a judgment that I want to leave open to everyone in this room to think of for themselves. If we are to accept the diagnosis of slavery, though, I think it's imperative for us to transcend the limits of story conventions and of definitions of slavery that cast the slave in a role of a victim, pure, a captive, pure and simple. Simplistic renderings of unfreedom and its causes imply falsely that unfree workers in this case are bereft of the capacity to effect change for the better. To become conscious of the full extent of the wrongs, our sociology of slavery must go beyond the victim-perpetrator dyad, and our legal forensics must go beyond evidence of force or deception. We must, I think, as consumers of human rights reportage, be deeply skeptical of portrayals of unfreedom which suggest that there is no room for the oppressed to take the lead in agitating for their own liberation. On this, I think, depends the fulfillment of our responsibility to not just do something, but do something effective. A particular concern, then, is how much attention gravitates to the evil sugar barons in these stories, and how little the Dominican state is held culpable for holding not only the immigrants, but increasingly it is feared their children and their grandchildren in a legal limbo. So I would urge anyone who's interested in studying this issue or producing a documentary film on it to hew meticulously to the issues as they are being defined by Haitian-Dominican rights leaders. A week ago, I spent an hour and a half interviewing Sonia Pierre, and neither the words esclavitud moderna, new slavery, nor any other mention of slavery was even mentioned by her once. So, let's leave these media reports behind and get a little bit more background to try and understand how it is that Haitian-Dominican rights organizations are pursuing a much broader agenda than what we see represented in allegations of new slavery. The sugar industry and the system of migrant labor recruitment and exploitation that is denounced in The Price of Sugar have, broadly speaking, both been around for about 100 years. Already by the second decade of the 20th century, there operated a system of labor recruitment much like that which is denounced in The Price of Sugar. Agents were sent into the Haitian countryside to gather together groups of workers to cross onto the Dominican side of the border. While the Vicini family, the sugar barons in this film, were important players in the creation of that system of unfree labor on Dominican sugar plantations, greater responsibility by far rests with the U.S. government and with U.S.-owned corporations, who had risen to a position of dominance in the Dominican sugar industry in the latter end of this formative period of the first quarter of the 20th century. So regarding the details of history, let me suffice just to say that U.S. fingerprints are all over the scene of this crime. Accomplice to rights infringement seems to describe the United States' role in this case better than independent third-party arbiter. Talk by U.S. State Department or congressional representatives of bringing the Dominican government to comply with its international human rights treaty obligations sounds hollow to Dominicans' ears, as long as it is projected from a sanctimonious remove that can be maintained only by failing to mention the complicity of the United States in creating this system of exploitation. So, if a U.S. representative is to sit down with representatives of Haiti and the Dominican government for a frank and constructive exchange, it must be with recognition that the United States bears responsibility as well. has a responsibility that stems from its own culpability for having created these conditions. I think that economic decline on the sugar estates is also a very important part of the picture that is being neglected in the price of sugar. This is the main fact blight on Dominican sugar estates today. The country's total sugar production is only a small fraction of what it was in the late 1970s. And sugar exports to the United States, though experiencing an uptick since DR CAFTA came into effect in 2005, are less than half of their former peak level. If you take into account U.S. support for IMF-backed neoliberal reform in the Dominican Republic and free trade policies, then the inescapable conclusion is that the United States' stance toward the Dominican sugar industry has been at best unsupportive. The consequences for sugar workers and their families have been disastrous. When I began my fieldwork in Batey Montecoca on the Ingenio Consuelo in 1985, it would have been inconceivable to me that the poverty and the uncertainty that I saw there could get any worse. And yet it has gotten worse, to the degree that Batey residents are no longer sure if the enterprise that has sustained them, and in some cases fed their families for decades, will even have employment for them in the next crop season. Also, the private lessees of state-owned plantations, the Dominican state having withdrawn from direct participation in sugar production and simply leased out its properties to private enterprises. These private lessees have repudiated really any responsibility for the maintenance of worker housing, wells for potable water, and schools. The pressure of heightened poverty is being expressed and felt by families who no longer have the means to send their children to school. So in this way, heightened poverty eventuates a range of injustices and rights infringements. In recent decades, Haitian men and women in the tens of thousands have moved away from sugarcane work and taken up the bottommost jobs in other sectors of the Dominican economy. The vast majority of Haitian immigrants and even large numbers of their Dominican-born children lack official residency permit or identity and citizenship papers, whether from the Dominican or the Haitian state. These are people that are truly without documentation of any kind. Undocumented is not a metaphor when we're talking about them. These are people who may have no way of establishing where, what nation they belong to. Nothing other than the simple fact that they are members of the Dominican political economy at this point in their lives. So illegal residency affects them just as it affects millions of undocumented workers in the United States. It's a status that opens the door to payment of inferior wages, exposure to dangerous work conditions, and illegal suppression of labor union organizing. Even so, the prospect of irregular residency being inherited by the children and the grandchildren of those immigrants makes the Dominican government's lack of compliance with international law arguably different in kind and certainly of greater severity. It threatens to create a group of perpetually stateless people, forever marked for exploitation, enforceable by the threat of deportation. I've likened the basic rights infringements that are commonly inflicted upon members of the Haitian-Dominican community to an onion, a dense, layered mass of mutually supporting injustices, wearing away at the outermost, most obvious abuses, reveals other abuses underneath, with those that remain stubbornly retaining the shape and bitter flavor of unfreedom. that wearing away at the most obvious and flagrant abuses that make up the onion of oppression, is, metaphorically speaking, the story of the first 20 years of international advocacy on behalf of the rights of people of Haitian ancestry in the Dominican Republic. From the earliest denunciations of new slavery in 1978 until the newly inaugurated government of President Martinez brought the government's involvement in the forced relocation of undocumented Haitians to a halt in 1997. International monitors and journalists had paid attention to the coerced exploitation of Haitian workers in the sugar industry. If you permit to extend the vegetal metaphor a little bit more, by contrast, beginning in the early 1980s, the activist praxis of Haitian-Dominican rights groups has been to pierce to the core of the onion's heart by simultaneously militating for economic development, women's empowerment, cultural revitalization, and constitutional rights. It's remained constant over the years then that the Haitian-Dominican group's methods and agenda have contrasted with those of internationally led solidarity, contrasted by encompassing a much broader spectrum of rights infringements and injustices. They have attacked all of the layers of oppression at one and the same time. So here are some of the ways in which MUDA and other Haitian-Dominican rights organizations, on a very small and local level, they're opening little pinpricks in this onion of oppression. This is some of the ways that they're trying to mash up the onion of oppression from within. The emphasis throughout has been the integration of pro-poor interventions and feminist interventions with the humanitarian and the educational work that is necessary to protect the most vulnerable members of the community from the worst effects of exploitation and neglect. An important aspect of these organizations' educational outreach is correcting the anti-Haitian and anti-Black propaganda that is set forth by Dominican history books, but especially by the Dominican media. If children do not learn the positive aspects of what it means to be Haitian, of Haitian history, identity, and culture, when they're faced with this anti-Haitian propaganda, the only response available to them will be to internalize that rejection of everything Haitian, that negative connotation that is associated by the media with Haiti. And as a consequence, those young people will attempt to disguise or flee from their Haitian ancestry. So the variability of Haitian-Dominican organizations to organize around their distinctive identity as a group is premised on cultural revitalization to combat what is already a generations-old tendency for people of the Haitian minority who attain greater wealth or who attain educational credentials to forget that they are Haitian and attempt to pass as Dominicans, pure and simple. Again, the methodology is a hybrid. These organizations certainly don't reject legal remedies. And especially in the case of MUDA, they partnered enthusiastically with international human rights lawyers. But they mainly sought an integrated, patient, community by community, capacity building kind of an approach to dealing with the multiple sources of inequality with which they have to struggle. I'm not sure if I gave you this quotation. It might have been something that I had to leave out from the printout, just to get it on the 6 pages. The point of Paulinia's statement is that it's out of a practical struggle for change not an a priori philosophical commitment that the Haitian-Dominican NGOs develop their rigorous adherence to the principle of the indivisibility of civil and political from economic, social, and cultural rights. According to Antonio Podemil,